For a young Luftwaffe pilot skimming the treetops of the Western Front in 1944, the true terror of the sky did not arrive as a sleek, nimble adversary. It came as a massive 7-ton shadow hurtling downward with the unstoppable momentum of a falling mountain. Through the oil-splattered windscreen of a Focke-Wulf, the sudden appearance of a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt diving from the grey overcast was enough to make the most seasoned German aviator's blood run cold. It was an engineering marvel that defied conventional aerial tactics, a flying fortress of armor plate and high-octane fuel that simply refused to die, turning the low-altitude arena into a deadly, inescapable trap. Why did the veterans of the Luftwaffe, flying some of the most advanced fighter designs in Western Europe, find themselves paralyzed with dread when forced to engage this American jug close to the deck? What was the secret behind a high-altitude escort fighter's transition into the ultimate low-level terror? And why did German pilots fear this Allied masterpiece more than almost any other weapon in the Western sky? To understand the deep-seated dread that the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt instilled in the hearts of Luftwaffe pilots, one must first look at the rapidly shifting landscape of the European air war between 1943 and 1944. For years, the air battle over the Reich had been fought in the freezing thin air of the upper atmosphere above 20,000 feet. Here, the Luftwaffe's standard fighters, the venerable Messerschmitt 109 and the formidable Focke-Wulf FW-190, reigned supreme in their design elements, optimized for high-speed intercepts, vertical climbs, and tight energy-retentive maneuvers. The pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26 Schlageter and Jagdgeschwader 2 Richthofen were masters of this high-altitude chess game. They understood the physical limits of their machines and those of the Allied bombers they hunted. However, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the nature of the air war underwent a violent tectonic shift. The battleground was dragged down from the stratosphere directly into the mud, rivers and narrow valleys of occupied France and Belgium. It was a realm where the Luftwaffe's traditional tactical advantages evaporated, and where a new, seemingly invincible predator would establish absolute dominance. At the center of this low-level crucible was an aircraft that, on paper, seemed entirely unsuited for the close-quarters, low-altitude brawl. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, affectionately termed the Jug by its crews due to its milk jug profile, was originally envisioned by its designer, Alexander Kartveli, as a high-altitude interceptor. It was built around the largest aircraft engine available at the time, the 18-cylinder Pratt Whitney R-2800 double WASP radial engine, coupled with a massive turbo-supercharger system that ran the entire length of the fuselage to the tail. Weighing over 7 tons when fully loaded, it was nearly twice as heavy as the Bf-109. To German aeronautical engineers, the Thunderbolt initially appeared to be a lumbering, oversized target. Its massive cross-section and immense weight seemed to contradict the fundamental laws of dogfighting, which favored lightness, agility, and a tight turning radius. Yet it was precisely this overwhelming mass and brute force engineering that would soon make the Thunderbolt an unstoppable force of nature when brought down to the deck. The strategic pivot occurred in early 1944, when the long-range North American P-51 Mustang began to assume the primary responsibility of escorting strategic bombers deep into Germany. This transition allowed the 9th Air Force to reassign its massive fleets of Thunderbolts to a new, devastating role: tactical air interdiction and close air support. Descending from the high heavens, hundreds of P-47s began patrolling the low-altitude corridors of Western Europe, hunting anything that moved on rails, roads, or rivers. For the German ground forces, this meant total paralysis during daylight hours. For the Luftwaffe, it meant they were forced to fly and fight in an environment where their sleek fighters were stripped of their primary survival mechanism, altitude. At 5,000 feet or lower, there was no room to dive away from an attacker, no space to recover from a stall, and no margin for error. The sky was cluttered with trees, hills, flak, and the relentless swarming presence of the 9th's tactical fighters. This low-altitude arena quickly became a meat grinder for German fighter wings. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine had always relied on the energy fight, climbing high, diving on an enemy, and converting that gravitational energy back into altitude. But at low altitudes, there was no gravitational energy to harvest. Every engagement became a brutal horizontal slugfest of engine torque, roll rate, and structural survivability. It was here that the German pilots discovered, to their horror, that the massive American fighter they had once dismissed as a flying bathtub was not only exceptionally fast near the ground, but also practically indestructible. When a German pilot fired a burst from his MG-151 cannons into a Mustang or a Spitfire, he could expect a catastrophic failure of the cooling system or structural breakup. But against the Thunderbolt, those same rounds often seemed to bounce off. The radial engine, unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines of the German fighters, lacked a vulnerable radiator and could continue running even with multiple cylinders blown completely away. This structural resilience completely upended the psychological dynamic of aerial combat. To understand this technological imbalance, one must examine the dense, oxygen-rich air of the low-altitude envelope, where engine performance behaved entirely differently than it did at 30,000 feet. The heart of the Thunderbolt's low-level performance was the Pratt Whitney R-2800 59 Double Wasp, engine equipped with water injection technology. While the complex turbo supercharger system was designed to keep the engine breathing in the stratosphere, at sea level, the thick air combined with wet combat emergency power allowed the R-2800 to unleash an astonishing 2,800 horsepower. German engines like the Daimler-Benz DB650 powering the Messerschmitt Bf109G were highly sensitive to heat buildup and possessed strictly limited emergency power run times before catastrophic thermal failure occurred. When a P-47 pilot shoved the throttle forward near the deck, the water-methanol mixture injected into the cylinders instantly cooled the intake charge, preventing detonation and generating a surge of raw, low-level speed that caught Luftwaffe pilots completely off guard. German aviators accustomed to outrunning older Allied designs suddenly found themselves unable to shake a pursuing jug, even in a flat sprint across the countryside. Furthermore, the aerodynamic behavior of the P-47 at high speeds near the ground defied its bulky appearance. The massive aircraft possessed an incredibly high wing loading, which, while detrimental to tight, low-speed turning maneuvers, gave the aircraft immense stability in turbulent, low-level air. While a light Bf109 bounced violently in the thermal currents rising from summer fields, making precise gunnery extraordinarily difficult, the heavy Thunderbolt rode through the turbulence as if on rails. Additionally, the introduction of the paddle-blade Curtiss-Wright propeller in late-model P-47Ds radically improved its acceleration and rate of climb at low altitudes, converting the engine's immense torque into immediate forward thrust. Luftwaffe pilots who attempted to escape by diving, a standard defensive maneuver against lighter British Spitfires, quickly realized that a dive away from a P-47 was a fatal mistake. The 7-ton Thunderbolt accelerated in a dive with terrifying rapidity, its massive kinetic energy allowing it to close the distance on a diving German fighter in a matter of seconds, leaving the fleeing pilot with nowhere to hide. The physical strain on the German pilots trying to counter these characteristics was immense. At low altitude, the air is thick, and the aerodynamic forces acting on control surfaces increase exponentially with speed. In a high-speed dive or a hard banking turn close to the trees, the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and the Messerschmitt Bf-109 became notoriously heavy and stiff, a phenomenon known as aerodynamic compression. A German pilot had to exert massive physical force on the control stick just to maintain a turn. In contrast, the later production blocks of the P-47D featured hydraulically assisted utility systems and meticulously designed control surfaces that remained highly responsive even at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour on the deck. This meant that while a German pilot was physically wrestling with his stiffening aircraft, struggling to bring his sights to bear, the American pilot could effortlessly roll his massive fighter, execute a high-speed bank, and line up a devastating deflection shot. This combination of superior low-level structural integrity, raw horsepower, and unexpected maneuverability at high speeds turned the tactical tables completely. Luftwaffe commanders realized that their young, increasingly inexperienced replacement pilots were being sent into an aerial arena where every physical law favored the heavier, sturdier American machine. Survival for a German fighter pilot no longer depended on clever aerobatics or daring close-quarters dogfights. It depended on avoiding the low-altitude trap entirely. But as the Allied ground forces advanced across Europe, avoiding the low-altitude airspace became impossible, forcing the Luftwaffe to confront these massive predators on terms that were increasingly dictated by the relentless, crushing weight of Allied industrial superiority, a superiority that manifested in the deeply personalized terrors felt by every German soldier who dared to look up at the sky. For the German fighter pilots patrolling the low-altitude corridors, this terror was first and foremost represented by a weapon system that did not rely on the precision of a scalpel, but on the sheer, crushing force of a sledgehammer. The 8 wing-mounted AN-M2 Browning .5 caliber machine guns of the Thunderbolt. While standard German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 carried a mix of fast-firing but low-capacity 20mm cannons and lighter cowl machine guns, the P-47 arrived with an unprecedented volume of fire. When all 8 of these heavy machine guns fired simultaneously, they unleashed a torrent of nearly 100 heavy, armor-piercing and incendiary rounds per second. At the designated convergence point, typically 300 yards ahead of the aircraft, this stream of metal formed a physical wall of destruction. It did not merely damage enemy aircraft, it literally sawed them in half. Wood, canvas, and light duralumin structures of German fighters disintegrated under the kinetic impact. One Luftwaffe veteran, Unteroffizier Georg Artmann, recalled the terrifying visual of encountering this wall of lead, writing in his diary, "To be caught in the focus of a Thunderbolt's guns is to see the sky ahead turn into a solid sheet of white fire, followed instantly by the sound of iron sleet shredding your wings as if they were made of paper." This lethal volume of fire was compounded by the P-47's almost supernatural ability to absorb punishment. In the high-speed, chaotic engagements close to the tree line, getting into a firing position was half the battle. Actually bringing the giant American aircraft down was another matter entirely. The Luftwaffe's tactical manuals emphasized targeting the engine and cooling systems of enemy fighters, a highly effective method against the liquid-cooled engines of the P-51 Mustang or the British Spitfire. But the P-47's Pratt Whitney R-2800 was a rugged, air-cooled radial engine. It possessed no radiator, no coolant lines, and no fragile water jackets. German pilots fired their highly prized 20mm Minengeschoss into the cowlings of the Jug, expecting a sudden plume of white smoke and seizing engine. Instead, they watched in utter disbelief as the massive radial engine swallowed the high-explosive rounds, coughed out a brief puff of dark oil smoke, and continued to fly. It was not uncommon for a Thunderbolt to return to base with entire cylinders blown away, pushrods bent, and the fuselage peppered with hundreds of shrapnel holes. This structural durability had a devastating psychological effect on German aircrews. It upended the traditional equation of aerial combat, where a well-placed burst from a skilled marksman guaranteed a kill. Luftwaffe pilots began to feel as though they were fighting a machine that existed outside the boundaries of normal vulnerability. This feeling of helplessness was particularly acute in head-on passes, a traditional defensive maneuver used by German pilots to break up enemy formations. In a head-on engagement, the massive bulk of the P-47's radial engine acted as a giant steel shield, protecting both the pilot and the fuel tanks from frontal fire. Meanwhile, the German pilot, flying a narrow-nosed Bf-109 with a vulnerable liquid radiator directly beneath the engine, had to fly straight into the concentrated path of 8 heavy machine guns. It was an act of tactical suicide. Luftwaffe squadron commanders quickly issued strict orders. Under no circumstances were pilots to engage a Thunderbolt in a head-on run. As the summer of 1944 wore on, this sense of dread deepened as the Luftwaffe realized that the P-47's defensive invulnerability was only one side of the coin. The true, inescapable horror of the P-47 lay in how its pilots utilized this rugged airframe to execute a highly aggressive, offensive tactic that shattered the nerves of German pilots before they could even lift their wheels off the ground. The Americans had developed a low-altitude patrol system that did not wait for the Luftwaffe to rise and fight in the sky, but instead hunted them directly in their own backyards, creating a state of constant, paralyzing siege that would soon push the German fighter arm to the very brink of collapse. But what happened next was a tactical development so brutal it would make even the safest airfields deep inside Germany feel like frontline trenches. It was at this precise moment of vulnerability that the P-47s would strike. Diving from the shadows at over 400 miles per hour, the massive American fighters would sweep across the landing patterns, their 8 half-inch machine guns chewing through the fragile landing gear and unarmored bellies of the descending German aircraft. For a Luftwaffe pilot, there was no escape. They lacked the speed to run, the altitude to dive, or the fuel to fight back. The airfield's light anti-aircraft artillery, such as the rapid-firing 20mm and 37mm flak guns, was often hesitant to fire into the low-altitude chaos for fear of hitting their own landing aircraft. Even when the flak crews did open fire, the heavily armored Jug frequently shrugged off the light shrapnel, completing its deadly strafing run and soaring back into the clouds unscathed. The psychological trauma of being hunted in one's own landing pattern shattered the morale of even the most hardened German veterans, who realized that the sanctuary of their own bases was permanently erased. This sense of absolute vulnerability was further magnified when the P-47 shifted from a pure air superiority fighter into a devastating close support platform. Under the wings of the Jug, ground crews began mounting triple-tube M8 rocket launchers and eventually 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVAR, alongside massive 1,000-pound bombs. When a squadron of P-47s descended upon a German column or a defensive line, they did not just strafe, they unleashed a localized apocalypse. The blast radius of their heavy bombs and the kinetic impact of their rockets shattered concrete fortifications and tore armored vehicles apart. The Luftwaffe was repeatedly ordered to fly low-level intercept missions to protect their remaining ground forces from these devastating air attacks. But in doing so, the German pilots were forced to enter the very heart of the P-47's preferred combat zone. They were dragged into high-speed, high-G horizontal turns close to the deck, where the heavy wing loading and superior roll rate of the Thunderbolt allowed American pilots to effortlessly outturn and outrun their opponents. The sheer scale of this low-altitude encirclement meant that the Luftwaffe was systematically choked out of its own airspace. It was no longer a matter of fighting for honor or tactical advantage. It was a desperate struggle for sheer survival. German pilots began to realize that every mission flown at low altitude was a calculated gamble where the odds were overwhelmingly stacked against them. The mechanical reliability, overwhelming firepower, and rugged construction of the P-47 had effectively transformed the low-altitude sky into an active graveyard for Germany's remaining aviation elite. As the winter of 1944 approached, the cumulative impact of these relentless low-level losses began to show its true devastating face, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the war in the West and leaving a legacy of terror that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. In the final desperate months of the Third Reich, as German military intelligence compiled its after-action reports and tactical assessments, the true strategic impact of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt became undeniably clear. For the commanders of Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, the Jug was no longer merely a tactical nuisance. It was identified as the primary catalyst for the complete paralysis of the German army on the Western Front. Late-war German intelligence documents consistently highlighted the P-47's low-altitude dominance as a barrier that made any large-scale daytime movement of troops, armor, or fuel impossible. Even during the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, initially launched under the cover of thick winter fog to ground Allied air power, the sudden clearing of the skies brought hundreds of rocket-armed Thunderbolts screaming down into the narrow valleys. The resulting slaughter of armored columns and supply trains demonstrated that the German army could no longer execute defensive or offensive operations without being systematically dismantled from the air. The Luftwaffe's inability to protect its own ground forces from these relentless, low-level attacks was a bitter admission of a total systemic failure in their air defense strategy. In a frantic effort to counter this low-altitude crisis, the Luftwaffe attempted several desperate tactical and technological shifts. They rushed advanced fighter variants into service, most notably the long-nosed Focke-Wulf FW-190D9 and the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. These aircraft were technically superior in speed and climbing ability, yet they were instantly neutralized by the realities of the late-war theater. Jet engines, while incredibly fast, were highly sensitive to dirt and debris on unpaved runways and consumed fuel at an unsustainable rate, making them poorly suited for the low-altitude dogfights and constant ground patrol duties to challenge the 9th Air Force. Furthermore, because P-47s constantly patrolled the skies directly above German jet bases, Me-262 pilots were routinely shot down during their slow, vulnerable takeoff and landing phases. The German fighter command was ultimately forced to rely almost entirely on passive defense measures, pouring their dwindling resources into thousands of light anti-aircraft gun batteries. This shifted the burden of defense from the pilot's stick to the flak crew's trigger, a tacit acknowledgement that the Luftwaffe had completely conceded the low-altitude skies to the American Thunderbolt. Beyond the physical destruction of their war machine, the psychological scars left by the P-47 on the surviving German pilot corps were deep and permanent. For the veterans who had survived the early glorious years of the Blitzkrieg, the transition from hunting to being hunted was a devastating blow to morale. The skies over Europe, once a theater where German tactical ingenuity and individual piloting skill could decide the outcome of a battle, had been converted into an automated industrial meat grinder. The Thunderbolt exemplified this transition. It was not a romantic, graceful bird of prey, but a relentless, heavy industrial tool designed to crush resistance through sheer durability, massive firepower, and endless mass production. To a young, semi-trained German recruit sent up with barely 40 hours of flight time, the sight of a P-47 diving toward him was not just a threat to his life, it was a physical manifestation of a global industrial power that his nation could never hope to match. Ultimately, the legacy of the Thunderbolt at low altitude redefined the very nature of tactical aviation. It proved that a high-altitude escort fighter, through rugged design and adaptable engineering, could descend to the deck and single-handedly rewrite the rules of close air support. For the Luftwaffe pilots who faced this heavy American giant, the experience of fighting the P-47 was a lesson in the futility of their struggle. They had spent years perfecting the art of the sleek, high-altitude dogfight, only to be dragged into the mud and branches of the low-altitude canopy and crushed by a machine that refused to break. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe in May 1945, the stories told by the surviving German aviators were not of sleek jet fighters or secret weapons, but of the massive, roaring shadow of the Jug waiting in the clouds, ready to strike the moment they lowered their landing gear. For the Axis soldier, it wasn't just the guns, planes, or tanks that were terrifying. It was the Allied ingenuity and industrial might they could never predict, embodied in a 7-ton flying fortress that simply would not die.